What if the most trusted man on American television knew the truth about everyone and said nothing? For 3 decades, Johnny Carson welcomed Hollywood's biggest stars onto his couch, smiling, listening, nodding along as carefully crafted stories were told to millions. But behind that calm facade, Carson carried secrets that could have ended careers overnight. In his final years, those secrets weighed on him, not because they were scandalous, but because of what they revealed about an industry built on silence, fear, and performance. Rock Hudson. Rock Hudson was the embodiment of mid-century American masculinity. Tall, handsome, effortlessly charming, he became the romantic ideal for millions of women during the 1950s and 1960s. On screen, he was dependable, desirable, and safe. On Johnny Carson's couch, he was warm, relaxed, and reassuringly familiar. But according to those closest to Carson, every Hudson appearance carried an unspoken tension that never reached the audience. Carson knew Hudson was gay. It was not a rumor whispered in dark corners, it was an open secret within Hollywood. What made it dangerous was Hudson's specific image. Unlike character actors or comedians, Hudson's career depended almost entirely on female fantasy. His studios had built him as the perfect heterosexual leading man, pairing him with actresses like Doris Day and selling a vision of romance that audiences desperately wanted to believe. Carson understood the stakes. One careless question, one poorly phrased joke, one moment of curiosity framed the wrong way, and Hudson's career would have collapsed instantly. Carson later described these interviews privately as walking through a minefield with a smile. Both men were performing. Hudson played the role America demanded. Carson played the host who didn't know. The machinery behind Hudson's image was relentless. His agent, Henry Wilson, orchestrated nearly every aspect of his life, including a highly publicized marriage to Wilson's secretary, Phyllis Gates. The marriage lasted only a few years, but it served its purpose. It silenced suspicion. Carson reportedly found these arrangements deeply unsettling, not because of Hudson's sexuality, but because of the institutional dishonesty required to sustain the lie. Hudson's death in 1985 from AIDS-related complications shattered the illusion permanently. Carson was profoundly affected. And those who worked with him recall that Hudson's passing forced Carson to confront his own role in maintaining these fictions. He had protected a man, but also helped preserve a system that denied him authenticity. In his later reflections, Carson did not frame Hudson's story as a scandal. He framed it as a tragedy of survival. Cary Grant. Cary Grant defined elegance. His voice, posture, and effortless wit made him the blueprint for sophisticated masculinity. To audiences, he was the consummate ladies' man, marrying 5 times and starring opposite Hollywood's most glamorous women. But to Johnny Carson, Grant represented one of the most striking examples of how completely an image could eclipse reality. Carson admired Grant deeply as a performer, yet privately, he was fascinated and troubled by the disconnect between Grant's public persona and his private life. For years, Grant lived with fellow actor Randolph Scott in a Santa Monica beach house, Hollywood insiders openly referred to as Bachelor Hall. The two men shared a home, routines, and a domestic life that was visible enough to be photographed, yet never officially acknowledged. Carson reportedly found it surreal to interview Grant while discussing his marriages, fully aware that Grant's most enduring relationship was never mentioned on air. Studio publicity framed the arrangement with Scott as simple bachelor companionship. Fan magazines published photographs of the two men exercising together, lounging at home, even preparing meals, images that today would read unmistakably as domestic partnership. Grant's marriages, and yet many historians now argue, functioned as lavender marriages, public relationships designed to reinforce heterosexual credibility rather than reflect emotional truth. Carson was not judgmental about this. What disturbed him was the psychological toll. Grant, born Archibald Leach, had constructed not just a career, but an identity capable of surviving a hostile era. Carson reportedly saw Grant as someone who perfected performance beyond the screen. The Cary Grant persona was armor. It allowed survival, success, and admiration, but at the cost of authenticity. Carson later expressed discomfort with how talk shows, including his own, helped sustain these narratives without question. In his final years, Carson reflected that Grant's elegance was not merely style, it was strategy. A carefully calibrated shield in a world that demanded illusion over truth. And Carson, seated inches away, had been one of the men entrusted with protecting it. Katharine Hepburn. Katharine Hepburn's public image was built on independence, intelligence, and defiance. She was unlike other stars of her era, unmarried, unapologetic, and uninterested in conforming to Hollywood's expectations of femininity. Yet the most enduring myth surrounding her life was not her rebellion, but her supposed 26-year romance with Spencer Tracy, a relationship long celebrated as cinema's greatest love story. Johnny Carson knew the legend did not tell the whole truth. According to those who discussed these matters privately with Carson late in his life, he believed the Hepburn-Tracy relationship functioned less as a conventional romance and more as a mutually protective arrangement. Tracy, a devout Catholic, remained legally married while separated from his wife. Hepburn, meanwhile, avoided marriage entirely, an unusual choice for a woman of her stature in mid-century Hollywood. Carson reportedly observed that the relationship solved multiple problems at once. For Tracy, it offered a socially acceptable explanation for his domestic life without divorce or scandal. For Hepburn, it provided a permanent answer to uncomfortable questions about why such a desirable woman remained single. The narrative satisfied the public and allowed both actors privacy. What fascinated Carson most was how thoroughly the story was embraced. Fan magazines, studio publicity, and later historians repeated the romance so often that it became untouchable. Meanwhile, Hepburn's closest personal relationships were largely with women, a fact Carson believed the industry quietly ignored as long as the Tracy story remained intact. Unlike other stars, Hepburn did not rely on studio-arranged dates or marriages. Instead, she withdrew, living largely outside Hollywood, cultivating a private life that resisted scrutiny. Carson admired this strategy. He saw it as a rare example of someone navigating the system without fully surrendering to it. In his later reflections, Carson viewed Hepburn not as deceptive, but as strategic. She gave Hollywood exactly the story it needed and nothing more. In doing so, she preserved her career, her privacy, and a measure of dignity in an industry that offered few safe options. Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando was celebrated as the great destroyer of artifice. His performances were raw, confrontational, and emotionally exposed. He brought authenticity to American acting in a way no one had before. Yet Johnny Carson found Brando to be one of the most paradoxical figures he ever encountered. Carson interviewed Brando multiple times and reportedly found him unsettling, not because he was dishonest, but because his honesty seemed selective. Brando cultivated an image of sexual dominance and rebellious masculinity. Public affairs, marriages, and children reinforced the persona. But Carson knew, as many in Hollywood did, that Brando's private life was far more fluid than his public image suggested. The irony was not lost on Carson. As here was the actor most associated with truth, someone who stripped performance down to its emotional core, while simultaneously maintaining significant personal fictions. Carson reportedly remarked on this contradiction in private conversations, describing Brando as someone who understood performance better than anyone, both on and off screen. Unlike others on Carson's couch, Brando was not entirely closeted. In later years, he spoke openly about his relationships with men. But during the height of his fame, those truths were carefully managed. Studios emphasized heterosexual exploits, reinforcing a version of Brando that audiences could safely admire. Carson believed Brando navigated the system differently. Rather than hiding completely, he overwhelmed it. His reputation for volatility, brilliance, and defiance made him difficult to control and therefore harder to expose. Carson saw this as a calculated balance, enough conventional masculinity to deflect scrutiny, paired with just enough ambiguity to remain unpredictable. What intrigued Carson most was how Brando helped redefine masculinity while simultaneously subverting it. He embodied strength, vulnerability, and contradiction, all while concealing aspects of himself that would have endangered his career. To Carson, Brando was proof that even radical authenticity had limits. Some truths, even for the boldest figures, remained too dangerous to share. James Dean. James Dean never sat on Johnny Carson's couch. He died before Carson took over The Tonight Show. Yet Carson spoke about him often in private, troubled by what he believed Dean's story represented. When Dean's career was brief, just 3 major films, but his impact was immediate and enduring. He became the symbol of youthful rebellion, emotional honesty, and authenticity. To Carson, that image was precisely what made the rumors surrounding Dean so disturbing. According to those familiar with Carson's reflections, he had heard persistent accounts suggesting Dean engaged in relationships with powerful men to advance his career. These stories circulated widely in Hollywood during and after Dean's life. Carson did not treat them as salacious gossip. He saw them as an indictment of a system that created such imbalanced power structures that ambition could become exploitation. What unsettled Carson was the contradiction. Dean was celebrated as the ultimate rebel, fearless, uncompromising, genuine. Yet if the rumors were true, his rise was shaped by the same transactional dynamics that trapped so many others. Carson reportedly emphasized that he did not judge Dean for this. He judged the system that made such choices necessary. Dean's death at 24 froze his image in time. Carson believed that this early death transformed potentially damaging truths into myth. Because Dean never lived long enough to navigate sustained fame, he was spared the prolonged performance others endured. His rebellion became romanticized, his complexity unresolved. Carson often noted that death protected Dean from exposure. The unanswered questions became part of the legend rather than threats to it. In that way, Dean escaped the long psychological burden carried by others on Carson's list. To Carson, James Dean represented a haunting possibility, that authenticity itself could be manufactured, and that even rebellion could be curated to serve the illusion Hollywood needed most. Marlene Dietrich. Marlene Dietrich never pretended to be ordinary. From the moment she arrived in Hollywood, she carried herself differently, her voice lower, her gaze steadier, her presence charged with ambiguity. Johnny Carson admired her deeply, not because she conformed, but because she didn't have to. Unlike many American stars of her era, Dietrich occupied a rare position. She was European, exotic, already framed as unconventional before audiences ever questioned her personal life. Carson understood that this distinction mattered. It gave Dietrich a freedom few others possessed. Dietrich was married to Rudolf Sieber for more than 5 decades. Yet their relationship functioned less as a conventional marriage and more as a strategic partnership. Both lived largely separate lives, pursuing relationships discreetly while maintaining a public image that satisfied studio expectations. Within Hollywood circles, Dietrich's bisexuality was well known. Carson reportedly found it remarkable how little effort she made to deny it privately. What fascinated Carson was how Dietrich transformed potential scandal into mystique. She wore men's suits, cultivated an androgynous style, and projected sexual confidence without apology. Rather than hiding, she stylized her truth. The public interpreted her ambiguity as sophistication rather than threat. Carson believed Dietrich understood something essential about Hollywood morality. It was less concerned with behavior than with framing. Heck, what would have destroyed an American actress could be tolerated, even admired in a European one. Dietrich leaned into that double standard, turning it into armor. In private conversations, Carson contrasted Dietrich with stars who constructed elaborate lies. She didn't invent false biographies or stage-managed marriages for credibility. She allowed ambiguity to do the work. Carson saw this as a form of quiet intelligence, a way to exist more authentically without confronting a system that could not be changed. To Carson, Dietrich represented an alternative path. Not freedom, but negotiation. And in that negotiation, she preserved something rare: self-recognition. Raymond Burr. Raymond Burr was one of the most trusted faces on American television. As Perry Mason, he played a man devoted to truth, logic, and justice. Johnny Carson interviewed Burr many times, always struck by his authority, composure, and gravitas. Privately, Carson found Burr's life profoundly tragic. According to those who worked closely with Carson, Burr maintained one of the most elaborate fictional biographies in Hollywood. On air, he spoke of multiple marriages, military service, and personal loss, including a wife and child allegedly killed during World War II. None of it was true. Carson reportedly described interviewing Burr as talking to a character. Burr had not only concealed his sexuality, he had replaced his entire personal history with a fabricated narrative designed to deflect curiosity and generate sympathy. Carson understood why. Burr's career depended on public trust, and in mid-century America, truth would have destroyed it. In reality, Burr lived for decades with his partner, Robert Benavides. Together, they ran an orchid business and vineyard, presenting themselves publicly as business associates. The stability of that private life stood in stark contrast to the fiction Burr maintained in public. What troubled Carson most was the psychological discipline required to sustain such a lie. Burr had to remember details of events that never occurred, relationships that never existed. Carson saw this as a constant performance one with no curtain call. The irony was impossible to ignore. Burr portrayed a champion of truth while living a life structured around deception. Carson reportedly found this contradiction heartbreaking rather than hypocritical. Burr was not dishonest by nature. He was responding to a system that punished honesty. In later years, and Carson reflected that Burr's story revealed the true cost of enforced silence. Not scandal, but exhaustion. A lifetime spent ensuring that nothing slipped. Charles Laughton and Elsa Lanchester. Charles Laughton and Elsa Lanchester were married for more than 30 years. To the public, theirs appeared to be one of Hollywood's most stable unions, a partnership between two respected actors with distinct, memorable careers. Johnny Carson, however, understood the marriage differently. According to Hollywood insiders whose accounts Carson trusted, both Laughton and Lanchester were gay. Their marriage functioned not as a romantic bond, but as a mutual shield and arrangement that allowed both to work, thrive, and remain protected in an unforgiving industry. Carson reportedly found this partnership unusually elegant. Unlike studio-arranged marriages that collapsed under pressure, Laughton and Lanchester built a genuine companionship. They shared creative interests, professional respect, and a loyalty that endured decades. Carson interviewed Lanchester several times after Laughton's death and noted how carefully she honored their public story without embellishment. She neither exposed nor contradicted it. Carson admired that restraint. It reflected an understanding of what could be said and what could not. What made their arrangement remarkable to Carson was its balance. Neither partner appeared trapped or erased. Instead, they constructed a life that allowed dignity within limitation. Carson saw this as one of the few examples where the system had been navigated without complete personal annihilation. Their marriage, Carson believed, it revealed something essential. Not all concealment was rooted in fear alone. Sometimes it was collaboration, a shared response to impossible rules. In the end, Carson did not view Laughton and Lanchester as deceptive figures. He saw them as architects of survival. Tyrone Power Tyrone Power was not simply a star. He was a studio asset engineered around beauty. His face launched fan clubs, magazine covers, and fantasies that sustained 20th Century Fox through the 1930s, 40s, and early 50s. Johnny Carson never interviewed Power. He died in 1958 before Carson took over The Tonight Show, but Carson heard his name repeatedly in private conversations with Hollywood veterans who had known him well. What struck Carson was how completely Power's public and private lives were divided. According to the accounts Carson trusted, Power lived a meticulously compartmentalized existence. By day, he was the ultimate matinee idol, carefully photographed with actresses, praised for his romantic intensity, and presented as the embodiment of heterosexual desire. By night, insiders claimed, he sought relationships that would have instantly destroyed that image if exposed. Power's marriages provided necessary cover. His union with French actress Annabella in particular served as a stabilizing narrative during his rise to stardom. Later marriages reinforced the illusion. Carson reportedly reflected that these relationships were not merely transactional. They involved real emotion, genuine affection, and in some cases, children. The reality was far more human than the word deception could capture. What haunted Carson was the imbalance. Power's extraordinary beauty created opportunity while simultaneously eliminating freedom. The more perfect the image, the less room there was to deviate from it. Carson observed privately that Power's face became a kind of contract, one he could never renegotiate. Unlike others who lived long enough to witness shifting cultural attitudes, Power died at 44. Carson believed this premature death locked his image permanently in place. The contradictions of his life were never resolved, never tested by time. To Carson, Tyrone Power represented one of Hollywood's cruelest equations. The closer a star came to perfection, the narrower their life became. Power was adored, but never allowed to exist. Randolph Scott. Randolph Scott rarely sat in the spotlight alone. His career was steady, respectable, and deliberately quiet. Well, he built a reputation as a reliable Western star, strong, reserved, uncontroversial. Johnny Carson interviewed Scott with ease, yet according to those close to Carson, there was one subject that never came up: Cary Grant. For more than a decade, Scott and Grant shared a home, a routine, and a life that Hollywood insiders understood perfectly well. Carson knew this. What unsettled him was not the relationship itself, but how completely it was erased in public conversation. Scott was framed as the loyal bachelor, Grant as the serial romantic. The narrative worked because no one challenged it. Carson later described Scott as the invisible half of a very visible truth. Unlike Grant, Scott did not cultivate glamour or mystery. He did not overwhelm scrutiny with charisma. He simply stepped aside. Carson believed this was intentional. Scott retired early, invested wisely, and lived quietly. He did not seek reinvention or late-life confession. Carson reportedly saw this as a different form of survival, one rooted in withdrawal rather than performance. Scott gave Hollywood what it needed, then removed himself before it could demand more. What stayed with Carson was how little curiosity the system allowed. No interviewer, including himself, ever asked the obvious questions. Not out of kindness, but out of mutual understanding. The silence was structural. In his final reflections, Carson viewed Scott as emblematic of the many men whose lives intersected with fame without being defined by it. Scott's story was not dramatic. It was efficient. And in a world built on spectacle, that efficiency ensured safety. To Carson, Randolph Scott was proof that sometimes the most powerful concealment required no invention at all, only agreement. Johnny Carson never exposed these men. He listened. He smiled. He moved on to the next guest. But in his final years, the weight of those silences lingered. Not because the secrets were shameful, but because the lies were necessary. These were not scandals. They were survival strategies in an era that punished truth. Carson understood that television didn't just entertain America, it helped maintain its illusions. And sometimes the most revealing stories are the ones that were never allowed to be told.